Tēnā koto katoa and hello everybody. Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. My name is Ben Adelberg and I'm coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Tēnei ka mihi ki te mana whenua o Aotearoa, and we acknowledge the local tribal authorities of New Zealand.
And g'day, I'm Emma Strutt and I'm currently coming to you from Yugambeh Country in Queensland. Before we dive into our conversation today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community.
We'd like to kick off with extending our thoughts to all of those affected in the very recent events that have taken place in New Zealand, in particular in the Northland, Auckland, Coromandel and the Gisborne Hawke's Bay regions. On this show, we have previously covered the topic of land use and the importance of soil, and a lot of that has been centered around food and a little even on its relationship with carbon sequestration. But land is where we live, and there is a relationship between the various types of earth and the impacts from climate change, which in turn impacts communities with worst-case scenarios resulting in displacement and loss of life even. So with significant climate events occurring more frequently, this is an opportunity for an important conversation we need to have now, and we are very fortunate to be able to call upon an expert.
That's right. So today we're talking with Associate Professor Martin Brook, a Chartered Geologist and Director of the Master of Engineering Geology degree at the University of Auckland. Martin has published over 80 journal articles, including many on landslide investigations, particularly on urban landslides in the North Island of New Zealand. So a very timely conversation following on from the impacts of Cyclone Gabrielle. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Kia ora tātou. Pleased to be here.
Martin, let's start with a little bit about yourself, personal background. You've had quite an extensive consulting career that's spanned a few countries, Australia, Middle East. Tell us a little bit about your journey and what exactly you do.
Yeah, okay. Well, started in Yorkshire, East Yorkshire. I was born there and brought up there, just, in a rural kind of area, and then went to university in Manchester for my bachelor degree, and then up to Scotland to do a PhD. And that started my travel sort of experience and my field work, and looking at slopes and rocks and things like that. And that was that PhD. Yeah, it was fundamental really to what I do today, I guess. And then so I finished that in 2000, and then worked in local government research hazards, and then I taught a bit at Massey University in Palmerston North, quaternary geology. So that was another stepping stone to what I'm doing now, I guess. Looking at soils and climate and environmental change, really, which is what it's all about. And then I left. We moved to Brisbane, and I was based in Brisbane. Worked for companies over there, in particular Golder Associates, which is a big Canadian multinational based in Milton there. And I worked in every state in Australia and also across the Middle East. So, that was interesting as well. And Australia is such a diverse country. I worked in every state. From Catherine and Northern Territory all the way down to Tasmania projects, and across WA and in cities a lot of the time, but also out in the bush. A lot of wildlife, especially not NT and places like that in Queensland as well. So that was interesting. We're in snake gaiters out in the field. And then they offered me this job at Auckland, so we moved back, and it's a good job I have. I like it because it's applied geology. So the idea is that I kind of link with industry, rather than I've not disrespecting my colleagues or anything like that, but there's a lot of aspects of geology which are quite esoteric, and textbook type stuff. That's not me. I like doing stuff which is applied and of interest to communities or companies or organizations or governments or agencies. So that's kind of what I do now, and especially to do with land instability in urban areas, which is obviously a real problem in New Zealand. It's quite topical at the moment.
Yeah. Now, this is a topic that we haven't really covered on the podcast before. So let's maybe just start with some basic 101. I know we're going to be talking about geohazards today. So firstly, what are they?
Right. Well, there's a range of geohazards. I mean, I'm interested in landslides. So, that's a generic term for the movement of soil or rock or whatever downslope, generally by gravity. And, landslides can be triggered by rainfall. They can be triggered by earthquakes, and they can also be triggered by human activity, cutting into a slope, for example. For a transport route. So in particular, to Toowoomba, the range crossing in Queensland at the moment, that's a recent infrastructure project, and some of my colleagues worked on that. And unfortunately, that was closed late last year, one of the lanes due to the slope failing there, a landslide. That's one aspect of geohazards, and then we could talk about flooding. Not really my kind of thing. Rivers. I've got a lot of colleagues who do that kind of work. I'm more into what's happening with the slopes above the rivers, above the river channels. But there's a range of geohazards, and we've got them all in Auckland. We've got 53 active volcanoes. So
Now, an obvious question, just to stay on the basics, is all soils or are all soils the same? I mean, what are we working with here?
No, they're not. They vary. I mean, you can break soils down into two types. This is very broad brush. One is a residual soil, and that's a soil which is formed by weathering of the rock underneath. So, over thousands of years or even longer, the rock breaks down due to climate weathering or chemical weathering. The rock sometimes dissolves if it's limestone. Um, that's one type of rock. Sorry, one type of soil, a residual soil. And in the tropics, these soils can be lovely red colors. They can be tens of meters deep. These residual soils. The other type of soil is a transported soil. So that's a soil which is formed of sediment or soil which has been moved down a slope by gravity or by water. So they're the two main types of soil: a residual soil and a transported soil. That's a very rough breakdown. Now, we can also characterize soils by lots of other reasons. In a lot more detail, we could look at the chemistry, the grain size, how compact the soil is, how strong it is. So that there's all sorts of different ways of classifying soils.
So that would then directly impact on risk assessments when it comes to geohazards. I mean, is that they play different
Yeah,
risks in different scenarios?
yeah, they do. There's it's hard to break this down really into too many sort of bite-sized chunks, but the clay chemistry, the clay content of the soil is important. So, one particular problem we have in Auckland are these nasty swelling clays, these montmorillonite clay minerals, and when they get wet, they swell. And when they dry out, they contract, and so you get this annual seasonal cycle of wetting and swelling and drying and shrinking. And you see this in Brisbane. When I lived there, we had in our front yard we had very clay-rich soils, and during the summer, sometimes things might dry out. More during the winter, actually, in Queensland, the soil would dry out and crack. In the summer, in the wet season, things wouldn't crack so much. But the soils do crack. So clay minerals are a big problem in soils. But the particle size is important too. If you've got a nice range of grain sizes in your soil, they can drain quite nicely. But if you've got a very tightly packed soil, very small grains, all tightly knitted together, the soil sometimes doesn't drain so well, and that's where problems can arise too.
So, what are some of the other influencing factors that can kind of predict, where and when a landslide might occur? Because I know the amount of rain that Auckland experienced was, of course, unprecedented. we seem to be using that word a lot lately, don't we?
Mm.
But outside of heavy rain, why are slips so frequent in the area? And of course the soil type as well plays into that. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a range of factors, and you know, climate is the key thing. I mean, we seem to be going through a funny time at the minute, and you know, we get 1.3 meters of rain in Auckland a year. Um, you know, everyone goes on about Manchester in the UK as being wet, or London, but they only get a meter of rain. So we get 30 centimeters more than that every year. So we are a wet climate in Auckland. We're a maritime climate. We're surrounded by water, so that's a key thing. Um, and you know it's been very wet. Now the soils, yeah, I mean that's a problem, and there's a range of factors: land use, building on steep slopes, um, loading slopes by building on them, building swimming pools on slopes. So if you think about a soil slope, you know you've got a driving force, gravity, and the weight of the material on the slope, and then you've got a resisting force, the strength of the material. And if you add weight or mass to the slope, then it increases that driving force. And we see a lot of that. We see a lot of building on slopes, swimming pools sometimes, especially in Gisborne. Um, and this causes instability problems. So the slopes on their own, a natural slope might be, you know, reasonably stable, but if you start changing the land by chopping trees down, building on these slopes, then problems can start to emerge. And there's a lot of detail goes into this kind of analysis. GNS and other geologists. So GNS is like the New Zealand Geological Survey for anyone in Australia. But GNS and other geologists do a lot of landslide susceptibility mapping, and that's where you look at a very high resolution 3D map of the land surface, a digital elevation model actually, and usually collected by LiDAR, so very high resolution. That's airborne laser scanning. So that's your base map, and then on top of that, you layer on all these other factors like slope angle, soil type, soil thickness, vegetation cover. It could be 10 or 20 different factors, and this is then analyzed statistically within a geographical information system. And from that, you develop a landslide susceptibility map. So there's a lot of variables involved, but a lot of it is to do with soil thickness, soil type, rock type, slope angle, vegetation cover. These are kind of the pointy end factors, if you like, the important ones. But there's a whole myriad of other factors that cause, or influence the distribution of landslides.
Given that there is that seasonal swelling and shrinking of soil, what could this potentially mean to us as we start to experience more extreme climate effects on top of everything you've already just mentioned?
Yeah, it is interesting because I just looked. There was a paper published late last year, and I think it's the first paper in New Zealand which has actually found, a real empirical sort of link between climate change and rainfall, and that was published very late last year, and it pointed out that we've had about 1.1 degrees warming since 1850, and that has put in, I think, about 7% more moisture into the atmosphere, and that then means when we get these big storm events, it kind of adds gives them about an extra 10% of rainfall. So we get that extra bit of oomph from these big rainfall events. So climate change is important. So that's certainly a factor that needs kind of careful analysis. And I know that GNS are doing some work on trying to predict rainfall and then landsliding based on rain radar data, so they can see the rain coming, where it's going to drop, where it's going to fall, and then they can come up with some kind of algorithm that predicts where there might be some landsliding based on the kind of susceptibility factors I was talking about before. Now, the soil shrinkage is a really important thing, because this kind of seasonal wetting drying, I should say it's important we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, first of all, because we've had this was an unprecedented rainfall event going on records from 1850, and that's from Anthony Fowler's work at University of Auckland. So it was an unprecedented event, but most houses stood up. certainly we had landslides and in Auckland, but they're in pockets, and we had flooding, which was terrible. And, and that is an issue. So it's important we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I say that because in the UK in 2021 August, so a summer actually in August in the UK, there's a town called Parton on the Lake District coast, and some cracks were found in the soil in the hillside, in the clay soil in the hillside. So the county council evacuated the town and closed the school down, and the school was closed for 14 months because they worried the hillside was moving. And nobody was allowed back in the town actually for about 10 days, so businesses suffered and all the rest of it. Anyway, after some really detailed monitoring and analysis, it was understood, look, the hillside isn't actually moving. The cracks in the hillside are just due to the soil shrinking at the end of a really dry summer. And it took 14 months for the school to be reopened. I think that was last September, October it reopened. So it's important that people aren't overly cautious about some of these issues. So it's about striking a really sweet spot and balance, going forward after kind of what's happened. But the clay shrinkage, yeah, it's a problem, and clays, I mean, they're a real problem. In Brisbane, often a house will be built on well, if it's not a Queenslander, a new build will be on a concrete slab with some reinforced steel in the concrete. And the more clay the soil, the more reactive the soil, then the more steel will be in the concrete slab to strengthen it. But in Auckland, for example, a lot of houses are just bit like Queenslanders. They're on wooden piles. So what happens is over time, over the year, the soil swells in usually in the winter, and shrinks in the summer, and you'll find you can't open your doors a bit, or your doors might start sticking a bit, or your windows, and this might change through the seasons. So that's the clay shrinking and swelling. So it can have those kind of quite minor effects, kind of nuisance effects. But it can also indicate, if you're on a slope, that the soil might be kind of not as stable as it might be as well.
In terms of assessing impact, so we've spoken a little bit about the impact of climate, and that's certainly potentially going to be an increasing factor over time. But how much does land use change also impact? So, I mean, we've been talking a lot about in urban areas as well, but a lot of the devastation is also in rural areas. So whether it's impacting farmers or main arterial routes, roads, train tracks, and so on. So how much is impacted by land use change, by the likes of forestry, agriculture, roading, and so on?
Well, you could start with forestry and look at northeast New Zealand, inland of Gisborne. And I think the Waipoua River there has the fourth highest specific sediment yield of any river in the world. So you could say it's the fourth most erodible catchment in the world. And yet it's full of radiata pine logging. So after Cyclone Bola in 1988, the Ministry of Primary Industries decided that we should plant a lot of pasture land and hill slopes with radiata pine. So radiata pine is Monterey pine, and it's from California. And I think the growth time over there is quite a few decades. But in eastern New Zealand, it's kind of the global sweet spot for radiata pine or Monterey pine, and the turnaround from planting to harvest is about 23 years. So these things grow like triffids in northeast New Zealand. So it's great for forestry companies. They can make a lot of money very quickly, but unfortunately, you plant and then harvest after 23, 24 years, and the soil then is exposed to the weather, and it's then replanted, and then you've got another 5 or 6 years before the canopy closes again, and that stops the rainfall entering the soil. So, and these are planted on very steep slopes in, as I say, some of the most erodible soils and rocks in the world. And really, if you're going to, it's great looking at things with hindsight, but if you're going to plan ahead, it's probably planting radiata pine, knowing they're going to be harvested every 20 odd years on steep slopes in some of the fourth most erodible terrain in the world. It's something you wouldn't do, but that's what we did. And it's ironic that the last big cyclone we had in New Zealand, Bowler, in 1988, the pine plantations were planted in response to that to try and stabilize the soil. And yet here we have caused a massive problem um, in this event, Gabriel, but also over the last 18 months as well. And we had a tragedy earlier in the year where a lot of these logs were floating around in the ocean. This was before Gabriel, and there's a little boy swimming off the beach there in Gisborne, and one of these logs killed him. It hit his head, and killed him, unfortunately. And so the logging industry, it's a real problem. And radiata pine are fine in other parts of New Zealand, but in northeast New Zealand and Hawke's Bay, on the slopes there, it's probably the last thing that really needs to be planted. And native forest is probably the way to go. It's going to put probably a lot of people out of work and have economic impacts, and then obviously socio-economic impacts, and a lot of other things. But the environment, if that isn't looked after, you have all these cascading issues that that come down from that. So the whole slash thing, it's an absolute disaster. I think the bridge at the river, that Hikawai River, I think the slash there took out the bridge. I've had master's students work on projects where smaller scale issues caused by a slash, of course, local problems, blocking culverts, and then then the water spills out onto the road, erodes the road away. These kind of issues. But I think we're seeing extreme problems with slash from Gabriel. But it was entirely predictable, unfortunately.
Yeah. And is it fair to say that if we look at impacts of agriculture, whether it's livestock or crops, it's still a common theme. We've been removing native growth, where it's bush or forest or even wetlands, but let's just call them entities that are equipped to deal with inundations of rainfall and so on, or even soil movement. But we're exposing that and we're weakening the substrate, aren't we, effectively, by changing that land?
Yeah, look, climate change is a fundamental problem, and we're just starting to see that now. But land use change, in New Zealand in particular, has probably largely overprinted any climate change issues up to now. And it's only maybe now that climate change is just starting to emerge and showing its kind of ugly head. But until now, land use change has been so profound here. It's quite incredible what's happened. And in fact, the Royal Society of New Zealand published a paper, a climate change report in 2017. And I remember the page 33 of that, and they say in that 2017 climate change report that until now, land use change has been so profound that it overprints any changes in climate on flooding in New Zealand. So that was 6 years ago. Now things might have started to change now, but that was the Royal Society of New Zealand, which is essentially a government agency, writing a climate change report, but kind of saying, well, look, climate change is important, but land use change has been so profound here that it's overprinting climate change. And that's incredible when you think about it, because if you go down to Southwestland and go to the glaciers like Franz Josef or Fox Glacier or Tasman Glacier at Mount Cook, the recession has been insane over the last 150 years. So the climate is certainly been changing, but land use change has been kind of covering that in a sense in large parts of New Zealand. It's been overprinting the climate change effects. It's quite incredible.
Yeah.
So I think I already know the answer to this from what you've just said, but given those concerns, and also given that the aim of the game in climate change adaptation is to foster more resilient communities, do you think that the current planning acts and the way councils are regulating land use, current risk assessment frameworks even, are they fit for purpose at the moment?
No, I don't think they are, but there's a lot of changes happening in the kind of legislative space in New Zealand at the moment, in all sorts of areas actually, from kind of research, which research programs here, government-funded research programs, which feed into legislation and policy, but also new legislation coming out of Parliament as well. So it's a real moving space at the moment, and I don't think things have been right. I think we've kind of been neglecting things. If you look back, um, probably New Zealand got a big shake, I guess, in terms of a natural hazard in 1979, where we had this giant landslide down in Dunedin at Abbotsford, massive landslide, and it destroyed about 140 properties or something like that. Nobody was killed because it was monitored, and the council knew it was starting to move, so people got evacuated, but a massive amount of houses were destroyed in a whole suburb, and in fact now it was turned into rugby fields and parkland. So, that was the starting point. And then, so there was a big inquiry into the Abbotsford landslide, why it happened, all the rest of it. And then the end of 1980, that reported. Then 1981, we had the Local Government Amendment Act, Section 641A, which then allowed councils to approve housing on unstable land and be absolved of any civil liability, which is incredible after what happened at Abbotsford 2 years prior to that. Now, after that, so that was 1981, and to be honest, there's some quite respected engineers wrote a paper on this in 1986 saying, look, that act 5 years ago is starting to cause problems because there's a lot of property developers doing silly things, to land that really should not be built on. So that was in 1986. A guy called Nick Rogers and another really respected engineer, Don McFarlane. Then 1991 we had a Building Act, and then 1993 we had the Resource Management Act, which brought a bit of sanity to things in terms of land development. Then we had Building Act came out again in 2004. So there's been a few changes since 1981. But if you look at the Auckland Unitary Plan, for example, it's not really based on geohazards or land use, or any kind of risks like that. It's kind of it's a plan. It's kind of like when the Brits arrived in New Zealand in 1850 with in Wellington. With a nice plan of what they're going to do with Wellington, nice grid pattern, without realizing that it's, this was dreamt up in London without realizing that Wellington's on hills. And the Auckland Unitary Plan is a bit like that. The Unitary Plan came out in 2016. Lovely plan, lots of glossy colours and all the rest of it, but it's not based on geohazards at all, or any kind of real hazard mapping, and that's a fundamental issue. And I think things will have to change in Auckland, because there's a lot of infilling going on, a lot of building. We've got way too many impermeable surfaces, way too much concrete, way too much tarmac. There's trees getting lopped down all over the place, which it's a real problem. And we build way too close to cliffs. If you walk along any North Shore beach, you'll see multi-million-dollar houses right up to the cliff edge, and this is weak rock. These houses are built on residual soil on top of weak rock, and some of these houses are now in a lot of trouble, and we've seen that since Gabriel. That there's landslips all around, and there's lots of houses now in trouble. The legislation has to change, and it is. And central government stuff is changing. There's a few things going through Parliament at the minute. One thing I would say, the National Adaptation Plan, which is well-meaning, that James Shaw from the Green Party has really been fundamentally behind. It's a well-meaning plan that's going to come out, but it's too high level. And in terms of national adaptation, there's nothing in there about setback distances, for example, or manage retreat. Now, managed retreat is such a big area, and there's nothing in the National Adaptation Plan about that, or who's going to pay for it. How's it going to be funded? So I think the National Adaptation Plan, which is coming out next year, I think that's missed a real opportunity in terms of adaptation. Yeah.
I've got to ask, because just the risks are obviously known now. So what is that going to mean in regards to insurance for landowners?
I think that well, there's already changes happening. So down in Nelson, for example, the northern part of the South Island here, um, insurers and actuaries are taking less of a broad brush approach. And I was listening to an actuary the other day from Sydney talking, and she said that usually, in New Zealand, natural hazards have been very much a broad brush approach, and insurance companies have seen, insurance policies are very much a social service, essentially, smoothing out, the problems in society. But that is now changing, and certainly in Nelson, people in particular streets in Nelson where there's land instability, their premiums have started to go up, and we're going to see that in Auckland, and that's been flagged by a few people. And a guy I work with from the Department of Commercial Law at the university, Chris Nicol, he's been flagging that as well. So I think there's going to be a lot more. Less of a kind of a broad brush smoothing approach to New Zealand insurance for hazards. It's going to be, probably more closely focused, and a higher resolution is looked at. So for some people, they might be insured out of their homes. If the premiums might be.
So in terms of managing risk, so insurance, and therefore better planning to start with, you mentioned Abbotsford in Dunedin, which has correctly been, and I think Christchurch is a good example as well. Land that was deemed, we're not going to build on this anymore. It's turned into open parks and so on. But in Auckland, on our west coast, Muriwai, I think it was the 60s, there was a big slip. And the slip that happened again now, which tragically killed two firemen, those homes built on the exact same spot as the first major slip that happened a few decades ago. How did we get that wrong? And and then from an insurance policy, I mean, surely they're going to say, well, hang on, we know there's a known risk. We're not even going to insure this. I mean, when are we going to get tough?
Yeah, look, I think things are changing in Muriwai. And look, Muriwai, I mean, the landslides in 1965, August, on Domain Crescent, the same area has been inundated and houses been destroyed this time. I should say the fatal landslides which killed the two firefighters were just a bit along the escarpment, exactly the same rock, Kahu Sands, Wheat Rock, but just a bit further along. But that was actually on 3 known landslide areas as well. But I think Muriwai will change. I mean, it was originally just a kind of a coastal settlement with a lot of batches. Holiday homes for the Australian viewers. Temporary holiday homes, essentially. And in fact, the 2 people who were killed there in 1965, they were holidaying there. They're staying in a holiday home. Since, obviously, COVID, people from the city have been probably moving out there a bit more and living there permanently in probably houses which, when they were constructed, they were only supposed to be temporary kind of accommodation, temporary sort of batches. So, you can imagine. I mean, you can't. I mean, Domain Crescent has been red stickered. So with the Section 124 of the Building Act, if you've got a red sticker on your home, that's it. So people won't be able to go back there, Domain Crescent. So that's quite a lot of houses there. If who's going to compensate them for that? Well, that's going to be interesting. I mean, you mentioned Christchurch before, and that was interesting, Ben, because with the River Avon there in the earthquakes, that whole area, that red zone they called it, 8,000 properties were bought out by the government, and whether that needs to happen in Auckland, 8,000 properties seems quite a lot, but certainly pockets of Auckland, Muriwai, Domain Crescent, Muriwai being one. You could possibly say Shore Road in Parnell.
That's where I live. So just down the road.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, right. Well, I mean, I drive down there quite often. I play cricket at Parnell as well, and so those slopes. I mean, those houses along there. I mean, very expensive houses. But we had a fatal landslide there in January, and the house next door, there was a fatal landslide there in 1997. So that was not again, there's obviously an issue with that area of shore road, very unstable material. So is it wise to place houses at the toe of the slope? So maybe those houses that have been red stickered now along shore road, that's probably the end of them. But can that land even be stabilized? Even if you remove the house, re-engineer everything, um, put up some kind of slope engineering, and can you still even build houses there? I don't know. I don't think it's going to be 8,000 houses like in Christchurch that need to be bought out by the government, but it might be in the hundreds, the low hundreds. Just
Yeah.
in particular pockets, Shore Road, maybe some cliff edges, maybe Domain Crescent Murray. I mean, we're speculating here, but there's a few little spots around Auckland that kind of spring to mind.
Mm. Now, an impact of we've been talking a lot about, and I know flooding's not your sort of key domain, but
Mm,
water plays an important role in this in terms of how it settles into the soil. And this would be more of a generic, I guess, question. But with a lot of urban areas, Auckland's a classic example, Brisbane as well. A lot of natural little streams and rivers that fed into the main, whether wetland area or main river like Brisbane. We've concreted those, or we've put them into little pipes, and we've we've taken away the natural flow for water, especially when there's a lot of it. And we saw it like in Beach Road, which I couldn't believe with that first massive rain. That whole place was underwater,
uh,
mind blowing.
yeah,
But then
yeah,
you realize, like, hang on, that's all reclaimed land. So naturally, that's where water would have
mm,
been. But we've built roads, buildings, etc. So, is do we need to go backwards a little bit, and do we need to open things up a little bit in these more populated areas to alleviate the pressure on these cliffs? And I'm calling them cliffs, you're calling them slopes, but
mm,
they're
yeah,
steep, they're sheer drops,
yeah,
and that's the
mm,
extent of how serious this is. It's not, oh, the house will slide down the hill. No, it drops, and that
mm,
that passing of life that happened here in Shore Road is it was
mm,
actually the resident at the bottom of that got
yeah,
effectively
yeah.
squashed by that landslide. So, do you think
Mm.
that would be an important part of perhaps starting to manage better for what's going to become more frequent, more big rains, more big climatic events?
Mm. Yeah, I do. I mean, everyone talks about spongy cities, and I think they're getting quite good at that in parts of Europe now. We need to do more of that. Auckland needs to be more spongy. Um, as you said, there's way too many impermeable surfaces. People love chopping trees down for the views, and I thought it was, with the landslides around Parnell Baths, people took the opportunity to take a chainsaw to some Pohutukawa trees there so they could, improve their views. And so we do seem to have this obsession that we need to improve our views. And for me, any tree is a good tree. It might be an exotic tree. If so, fine. Keep our trees, and we seem to we just seem to kind of want to get rid of vegetation. But we do need to make our cities more spongy. And rather than putting a concrete drive down, why not have some gravel? Put some put some weed mat down, and just put some gravel down, and let the water fall on the gravel drive and just percolate down into the soil. Little things like that. But everyone wants to have a concrete drive. Just a lot of changes could be made. Maybe we need to. Obviously, insurance companies don't like you having trees too close to your house, but you don't have to have trees on your property. What about some low bushes? Hedgerows here and there. Things like that. But we everyone seems to want to clear their sections and chop trees down. And it's the last thing. Maybe there needs to be tax breaks, or maybe you get a discount in your rates if you plant bush on your section. Probably financial incentives are probably the way to go. It could be an option, but people need to smarten up. And everyone talks about build back better, especially after Hurricane Katrina, where that came in 2004 in the US. Build back better and all the rest of it, but it really needs to be build back smarter. Um, and people need to be thinking about what they're doing. And just as I say, little things like um, a gravel drive, planting some bush, things like that. So spongy cities is a massive thing in the UK now. People are talking about it. I've got a colleague in Scotland who does a lot of work on it, and especially in Europe, and it's really something we need to get to grips with. And as you say, I mean, so much of the CBD is reclaimed land. Shore Road. I mean, Shore Road used to be the shore, so everything, everything to the north of Shore Road in Parnell is reclaimed as well. And there's lots of Auckland is like that. Swanson, I mean, the Swanson community group now, they've been flooded 7 times in 8 months, and they're saying, look, enough's enough. We want to be bought out. We don't want to live here anymore. And they're new builds. They're pretty new houses. So, but it just channels water is just channeled down there in Swanson. So yeah, we made some big mistakes. Yeah.
So this is going to be a very frustrating question because I acknowledge that this is a wicked problem, and you've already talked to some of the key steps that individuals can take. You've talked about the necessary policy changes, etc. But if we could boil it down to just like a few key things to build back smarter and more resilient, what would you be concentrating on first and foremost?
I think at a high level, a national adaptation plan that has levers in there for buying out people who find themselves in really unfortunate circumstances. Because with these events, in addition to homeowners that need to be compensated, and if they're going to be moving, there's a lot of inequities. And for example, if you're a family renting a property, you probably can't, in some parts of Auckland, you probably can't even afford insurance on your content on your possessions. You're just paying your rent. You've got no insurance for all your possessions. You've suddenly lost everything in a flood. So there needs to be, within the National Adaptation Plan, certainly homeowners, who really are the wealthy people in New Zealand, let's be honest, homeowners, but also people at the other end of the spectrum need to be covered within that adaptation plan. And there needs to be a lever in there to cover people who can't afford any insurance for their possessions, and they've lost everything, and they've now got to find a new rental to live in. So then you need to start at that sort of stage, national kind of adaptation plan that where there's levers to help people out. Then there needs to be better planning at a more local scale or a regional scale. So that could be, for example, if we know that, look, in the Waitakere part of West Auckland, we know that we've got these Waitakere volcanic rocks, and we know that on top of the rocks we've got a particular soil type, which is particularly unstable on slopes at a certain degree. So there's a few valleys there where we don't really want houses because the water gets funneled down them. The soils are very weak, so we're going to have problems. So there needs to be more. So the Auckland Unitary Plan, for example, that could have areas within it now that are considered for buyback and for managed retreat. So we need these national plans, but we also need kind of local government plans to do things, and then people, at an individual level, can do things. If you've got a nice house on a slope worth $3 or $4 million, don't install a swimming pool. Go, because you're adding, several tens of tons to the mass of the slope. So if you want to see your slope accelerate and start moving quickly, build a swimming pool on it. If you don't, go and swim at Parnell Baths or go to the beach or wherever else. So things like that, people can make individual decisions, but central government in Wellington is really important. Local councils are, but also individuals as well. And if you think back to local agenda to 1991 in Rio, LA 21, local agenda for the 21st century. That was all community-based resilience, really. And we need to go back to that. That Rio conference, 1991. And that, I was at high school when that was happening. That conference, it was really big in the news at the time. We learned a lot about it, and that was all about bottom-up sort of policies. People, small community groups helping themselves and making good decisions for the future, and making themselves more resilient to the environmental changes ahead. And I think we've kind of missed that, and that's 32 years ago, that conference in Rio. So
So for people looking to move into a new place, whether it be a rental or buying a new home, should we be now afraid of a home that is on a slope at the top or the bottom of it? Should that now be top of mind? In the past, it's go check the water pressure in the shower. If that's good, we're moving in. Now it's more, shit, is this place going to flood? Is this place going to collapse? Is this place going to shift?
Yeah.
Should we actually be worried about that now?
Possibly. I think people might pay more attention to LIM reports, so the Land Information Memorandum. So that's, when you buy a property in New Zealand, the bank, maybe the insurance company will want to see a copy of the LIM report. And if there's anything on there which indicates instability, it might actually be taken out of your hands, Ben, and the bank might say, no, we're not going to lend you the money because it's too risky. So I think, with the Building Act 2004, I think that's a Section 72 notice that can go on the title of a LIM report. I can't quite remember, but I think banks and insurance companies might be looking a bit more closely about what's on the LIM. It might not be your decision, Ben, as to whether you're going to buy a house. It might be Westpac's or ANZ's, whether they're going to lend you the money or not. I think that's what there might be a bit more of that now. It was interesting. About 5 years ago, some grads at Bristol University, some clever geology graduates there, set up a company, and they targeted themselves as a geohazards company for the housing industry, for the real estate industry, and they actually did really well. And they were churning out very quite succinct but accurate kind of geotechnical or geohazard reports for potential house buyers, and also for vendors as well. And that they did so well. They found a niche in the market there in the UK, and they did so well that they were bought out by a very big company very quickly. And we don't actually have that yet here, but if somebody sets up one of these, you could call it a baseline housing geotechnical report companies, focus just at the a standard kind of engineering or geohazard report for each house that comes on the market. That they could do really well, I think, because we don't have that. We've got a lot of geotechnical consultancies who will do various things, but this kind of geotechnical report or geohazard report for the real estate industry, there's nobody who really specializes specifically in that niche area, and I think it could be really useful, for vendors, for buyers, for insurance, because when you look to buy a property, obviously, you need a builder's report, don't you? Well, there's nothing on there about the geohazards or anything like that. It's more about the structural integrity of the building, and so I think something along those lines might help get a house purchase over the line, or it might give a potential purchaser some news that they don't really want, but is going to help them make a really good decision. So maybe a bit more intelligence and information brought into the house purchasing market could be good.
Well, there we have it. If there's any geology students listening to this, there could be a future career path in it for you. And if you need someone to help manage it, don't just come talk to me, and I might be keen to listen. Look, Professor Martin Brook, thank you so much. This has been a truly fascinating little insight into a sort of a topic that no one really thinks about, because you only know what you know, right? And these are the things you're not aware of until it rains, and then all of a sudden, what's going on here? So I think this has been really invaluable, and hopefully there's some little lessons picked out from there, and awareness is probably the most important starting point for anything. So, hopefully this inspires people to be a bit more, if they have any concerns, well, reach out to an expert. So thank you so much for your time. We're really, really appreciative. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Martin.
Kapai, you're welcome. Yep.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.